Hello, good evening, and welcome back to another episode of Don't Trust the Neighbours. I am Kirsty.
I'm Olivia.
And today is the very first time we're actually recording in the same room together. It's very exciting.
It's very exciting. It's very weird.
It is. We were just saying we normally have like a pre-chat catch-up, like pre-record catch-up when we first log on to do the episodes. And obviously we had that in person, and I was like, it's like having sex with no foreplay, just jumping straight into it.
Oh, it's so true.
No build-up.
It's fine. It's two women. We'd never let that happen.
It's the best part.
That's all our male listeners gone.
Yeah. Have you researched foreplay? So today we could not be talking about anything further than sex or foreplay. We are going to be talking about the 1993 Lucasville prison riot, a riot that would go on to last for 11 days and result in the murder of 10 inmates and one prison guard.
11 days? Wasn't that the same as... Was Attica 11 days?
I think it was around 11 days as well, Attica, yeah.
Oh, maybe it's like a magic universal number.
Yeah, like 7 is the number for magic in Harry Potter. 11 is the number for prison riots.
Yeah.
The Southern Ohio State Correctional Facility, or commonly known as Lucasville Prison, was built in 1972 and is located just outside the town of Lucasville in Ohio. It was built as a state-of-the-art new maximum security prison with the capacity to hold 1,600 prisoners. Within the walls of this prison were to be housed murderers, rapists, paedophiles, traffickers, basically the absolute worst of the worst of humanity. Although Lucasville was designed to be a maximum security prison and therefore automatically designated as high risk and dangerous, it seemed to be slightly more troublesome and harder to control than other prisons of its kind. By the mid-80s and early 90s, Lucasville had become so bad, it was well known within Ohio State as having a reputation of being dangerous and out of control.
Doesn't really sound like their plan to be state-of-the-art was really working out for them.
No, I don't think so. You can have all the technology you want, Olivia, but if you can't work it...
Yeah, I know. It's just like I'm trying to imagine state-of-the-art prisons where they just have those, like, you know, in McDonald's when you walk in and there's like those iPads that you can play games on, and that's what I'm imagining.
Did you just compare state-of-the-art maximum security prison to McDonald's?
I think I did. I'm sure there's a McDonald's in a prison somewhere. Don't they have it in the White House?
They probably did with the last president, to be fair.
Yeah.
That's the best analogy ever. I love it.
Did you see he had this big red button in his office, and then this journalist like asked him what is the big red button for, and then Trump pressed it, and then this journalist started freaking out and he was like, oh my god, what was it? And then someone just walked in with Diet Coke. But
it was his Diet Coke break button.
Yeah, it looked like that was the first thing that Joe Biden got rid of as well. He was just like, nope.
Yes, like that.
Anyway,
back to the story.
Prison McDonald's.
Yeah, back to prison McDonald's. So by the mid-80s and early 90s, Lucasville had become so bad. The well-known reputation as being a dangerous, out-of-control prison had kind of spread statewide. Inmates were regularly murdered within the walls, and in 1973, just a year after it was built, 2 prison officers were murdered by inmates, and again in 1990, a prison teacher was brutally murdered by an inmate.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When looking at how the prison was run, it's not so surprising that it was so out of control. Prisoners wore no ID tags and walked around the halls pretty freely. Roger Snodgrass, an inmate at this time, and who also went on to be a part of the riot, has said, and I quote, "There were so much drugs at Lucasville, you would have thought you were still on the streets with what you could get."
Oh, God. It doesn't sound like a very good correctional facility.
I think it was epically shit, mate. I think. So, not only have you got these highly dangerous people all locked up together, they're also high on God knows what. Snodgrass has also stated that it was not uncommon to be sitting in the food hall and have someone come up to the person sitting next to you and just slit their throat wide open in the food hall in front of everyone.
Shit.
Yeah, it's like Wild West times in a prison.
Yeah. It's like, let's get a bunch of the worst people in the planet and put them together, give them drugs and see what happens.
Literally.
Because I guarantee there probably were some of the prison officers bringing it in.
Oh, 100%. Obviously, a situation like this is going to draw attention. So the Ohio State Correctional Department did start to kind of pay a bit more attention to Lucasville and try and see what they could do in regards to sorting it out. To give another example of how dangerous it was, Mike Hensley, who was a prison guard at Lucasville, and he would also go on to be a hostage during the riots, has said, when you were inside, you were locked up just like them, meaning the inmates. If they sense weakness, they will act on it. You could go home that night, or you might not make it home. It was all up to the inmates. But it shouldn't be, because you're a prison officer in a prison, so it absolutely should not be up to the inmates if you go home or not.
Yeah. Thing is, what year is this?
It was built in 72 and the riot's 93, so in between those years.
Yeah, because they kind of, it's not like they're bringing in like highly qualified people to keep these inmates in check. Like they're bringing off every Tom, Dick and Harry.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. But realizing that Lucasville was really in a dire state, Ohio State Correctional Department knew that something had to be done. So in 1990, Art Tate was brought in as a new warden to try and turn Lucasville around. By the time he got there, although the prison was built to hold 1,600, there was around 2,100 prisoners there. Cells that were designed for one person were housing two, and these cells were small. They were roughly 10 feet by 6 feet, and they were housing two inmates. I mean, that is fucking tiny.
It's inhumane.
Oh, 100% inhumane, yeah, definitely. And I know it's not a unique situation to Lucasville or Ohio or even the United States. Like prisons all over the world are overcrowded, but 6 feet by 10 feet for two people is just ridiculous.
Yeah, and if one person gets sick, then it's going to infect everyone. And can you imagine if coronavirus went in?
Well, you know what? It's really interesting you say that, because part of sickness is actually going to go on to play a key role in this story. So, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But not only was it overcrowded, but within the overcrowding, mixed all in together, they had the gangster disciples, Bloods, Crips, Aryan Brotherhood, and mixed all in with that, they also had the Muslim population of the prison, all mixed in, together, crammed, overcrowded. This place was a shitstorm waiting to happen.
Yeah, I feel like if you were there, you'd feel like you were literally in hell. Like all the worst mesh of people.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
In one place together. Like not, I don't want to get that misconstrued. Muslims are not the worst people, but people who hate the other kind, like the Bloods and the Crips, you don't put them in the same place together.
Aryan Brotherhood who are some of the most nasty racist pieces of shits out there. What do they expect to happen? I mean, for Christ's sake.
Yeah.
So, Art Tate arrives in 1990 to Lucasville Prison. Within the first 5 days of him being there, 3 inmates have had their throats slit. So he's like, to get this under control, he said we had to make some pretty big changes. These changes included cutting prison programs, introduced mandatory drug tests, and mandatory escorted movement, meaning the prisoners had to be escorted by guards at all time. I know these are described as big changes, but isn't that just normal prison procedure?
Yeah, it's like I agree with the second two, but I think cutting programs, which is probably their only access to an education and like the only way to better themselves while they're in prison, I think that is a big mistake. Yeah, because that's like a lot of people are meant to find purpose in prison. Obviously, not in this prison, but
yeah, exactly. So as previously mentioned, the inmates pretty much did what they wanted and kind of ran the prison. So when Tate implemented these new rules, they were really not happy, and they weren't planning on being completely complacent and taking it lying down. So now not only do you have a very volatile situation with very dangerous people, they're now wound up and waiting to blow. It was going to take the smallest thing to ignite this situation. They were looking for any excuse to fight back. And what do you know? In 1993, an order from the Ohio State Correctional Department that they wanted all inmates across the state to be tested for tuberculosis or TB proved to be all they needed. If you have to be testing people for TB, a condition there's literally a fucking vaccine for, you have a serious condition like problem overcrowding. Like, it's not cool. So the test demand is where things really start to go completely, utterly arse over tit. Like, it goes downhill very, very fast from this point. As I was speaking earlier about the different types of people they had all crammed in together, there was a Muslim population within Lucasville prison, and they refused to take the test for TB because the test contained phenol. Phenol is an alcoholic substance, and in Islamic faith, any alcohol is forbidden to be used, consumed, transported. Like, alcohol is just forbidden. And therefore, the test, which included this form of alcohol, went against their faith and religion. So obviously they didn't want to take it.
Yeah.
So when Tate hears that they're kind of refusing to take the test, he calls kind of like, the correctional facility HQ, and he's pretty much told by them, get it done forcefully if it has to be. It's not an option.
That's disgusting.
Yeah. And yeah, completely. I know when you're in prison, you lose your rights to society, but that does not mean you lose your rights as a human. Human rights are human rights, simple as. And I know it's not the same situation, but back in 1913, during the suffrage movement, well, the UK suffrage movement anyway, the women who were imprisoned would often go on hunger strike. This resulted in the horrendous Cat and Mouse Act, when prison officers would take these women, strap their heads and bodies down to a bed, force their jaws open with a clamp, so literally metal clamp keeping their mouth open, force a tube down their throat into their stomach, and pour a substance like milk and raw eggs, beaten eggs down there to keep them quote-unquote fed. Today, we look back on that as such a shameful and barbaric act. But please tell me how this is different. And yes, I do understand that they're not fighting for the vote and they're being held in a maximum security prison because they've done really bad things, and suffragettes weren't. Well, actually, to be fair, suffragettes did blow stuff up, so I guess they maybe would be in a maximum security if it was today. But
the thing is,
yeah,
it's like, being a woman in this age, I do believe that if there wasn't a movement, then things like that would still be happening. The same thing as like husbands being able to put their wives on medication every time they kind of talk back to them and saying, oh, she's crazy. So they put you on some medication, which just makes you numb to everything. Yeah, completely. I do believe that without these movements, that would still be going on today. And I'm sure it does still happen.
Yeah, well, Bedlam, the obviously famous hospital in London, was filled up with a lot of women who maybe cheated or tried to leave their husbands, and they just said they were insane and they were committed. Yeah. Anyway, back to the story y'all came for. So Tate and his team, they obviously hear that this is mandatory, and they decide what they're going to do is lock the prison down for 3 days after the Easter weekend and conduct the tests. This means all inmates would be confined to their cells for 3 days and not allowed out at all until all tests were carried out forcefully if need be. Thinking that they have the perfect plan, they grant some guards some extra leave that's been requested over the Easter weekend so they can spend it with their holidays and carry on with the plan.
Oh, nightmare.
Yeah. What they did not account on was word of mouth and prison gossip.
Yeah.
Like all other prisons, some inmates at Lucasville had jobs. And like many other prisons, this also included working in like the admin offices. Therefore, the inmates in this position overheard the plans and fed it back to the prison population. In the prison, the inmates would kind of slip off into their own mini communities. And it kind of got back through all the communities that the Muslim community were refusing to take this because of religious reasons and it going against their faith. So the person who was kind of the quote-unquote leader of the Muslim community in Lucasville was a man called Sadiq Abdul Hassan. He was very respected by all the inmates in the prison. He was well educated and spoke very eloquently. So when he spoke, most of the inmates listened. So when the news of the lockdown and the forced tests got back to the other kind of leaders of the other groups, they took it straight to Sadiq.
Yeah.
Right, so this is where things go from 0 to like 6 million very quickly. Because, again, the informant worked in the office, the inmates knew that on Easter Sunday, Tate would be at home with his family and the guard count would be a little lighter than usual, with some people taking leave. So this is when they're going to make their move.
How did they not predict that something like this could happen?
It's just arrogance, though, isn't it? Just pure arrogance.
Also, there is something so powerful in all of these groups that hate each other kind of being united against the prison system, essentially.
Oh, yeah.
Like the amount of hate that must take to overcome all of that.
To fight back, yeah.
Mm.
So Roger Snodgrass, the man we spoke about earlier who was in the prison and was part of the riots, he had a job as well, and he kind of worked at the gym equipment area. So he passed several metal baseball bats to Sadiq and other members of the prison. They immediately entered the prison and beat the guard on the search point. So like the metal detector in the search area for prisons, when they come back in the yard, they have to go through and make sure they don't have any metal objects or anything on them they're going to hurt people with.
Yeah.
So they beat him pretty horrifically and then proceed straight to L Block. So L Block is a group of 8 wings, all connected by one corridor. Housed around about 1,000 prisoners. This was where they met the other inmates, and they began beating the guards and stealing their keys that were in L Block at that time. This was the beginning of a prison riot that's going to last 11 whole days. So as soon as the riot starts, some of the inmates that don't want to be involved manage to run and get out of L Block. However, about 450 prisoners stayed and actively took part in the riots. Dwayne Guinness, I think I'm saying his name right, was an inmate at the time, and he could see the riot starting. And he ran back to his cell to get his weed and pretty much thinks this will maybe be an hour or two until the guards take back control.
Get his weed. I love that.
Hunker down in the cell and get stoned and wait till it's over. That's his whole plan.
Same, to be honest. That's what I do.
I was like, fair play, mate.
Yeah.
However, when he sees several officers being beaten and their keys stolen, he thinks this might be a little bit worse. One of the officers who were being beaten was Kenneth Daniels. Daniels remembers the day starting off pretty normal. However, just about 3:15ish, he noticed there's no radio or TV noise coming, and it's really quiet. He then saw several inmates running past a door, completely unsupervised. So as he's about to go and be like, what the hell are you doing? A call comes over the radio, there's a riot in L Block and some officers were being beaten. So as he starts to run to his colleague's aid, more prisoners, and these are the ones that kind of escaped the riot, are running in the opposite direction from him. And they're telling him, do not go there, turn around and run. Whatever you do, just don't go there. He ignored them and he ran towards the riot to help his colleagues.
That's haunting.
Yeah.
What, so other prisoners told him that? Or?
Yeah.
It's heavy.
Yeah. When he got there, he found fellow officers being beaten. He himself was then beaten over the head and cuffed. Daniels had just become one of the 8 prison officers that were taken hostage. So in training, guards were told if there was ever a serious riot situation to go to the back room in L Block and lock the door. Both the door and the wall were reinforced. So any guards in there would then be rescued from the outside, as per protocol. However, apparently the builders, when actually building the prison, didn't follow protocol because neither the door or the wall was reinforced. And the newly freed inmates broke through to them without even breaking a sweat.
That's terrible.
Mm-hmm. It's shocking, isn't it?
That is just, oh my God. They could have been safe. They could have been not comfortable, but just like safe in their minds.
Yeah, exactly. So the inmates that had stayed now have full control of L Block, and they have 8 guards held hostage. The guards were stripped out of their uniforms and forced to dress into inmate outfits. Their IDs and keys were stolen. They were also blindfolded, handcuffed, and forced to kneel down in showers as they were held captive there. They've since spoken about inmates standing there in the showers with metal baseball bats just clunking them on the tile floor, letting them know that they were there and they had those weapons and they could kill them at any point of time.
Yeah.
According to Dwayne, remember the guy who's just going to get stoned in his cell? He then sees all the cell doors that were locked for all the big ones that are locked up all the time. They just all start opening. Yeah.
That's terrifying. This is like something out of a movie. But it's also like, if you're that guy who's just sat in your cell trying to ride it out, it's like you're all probably going to get punished. Like, they're not going to be able to figure out who did what. So you're probably going to get dragged into it anyway. Yeah. Like, not saying you may as well join in, but essentially, like, you're not out of the woods.
Yeah, exactly. So now at this point, he's like, shit, this is going to be bad. There is not one prisoner on L Block that is locked up, and old scores were being settled very quickly.
Yeah.
In the meantime, an officer who has kind of got out and escaped calls Art Tate and informs them of the riot. Tate, who was at Easter dinner with his family and friends, immediately left the meal and drove to the prison. By the time he got there around 6 p.m., so 3 hours after the riot started, Ohio State police troopers were already surrounding the perimeter of the prison, but had made no move to enter or storm the prison and were planning to start negotiation process.
Because I do wonder sometimes, it's like, can you storm before you try and negotiate? Like, just because then at least it's like they haven't made the threat of, if you come in here, we're going to kill them yet. So just go in first.
So inside the prison, L Block was fully under control of the inmates, and the officers that were being held hostage were starting to be moved from group to group. So what I mean by that, by being moved from group to group, is the quote-unquote gangs of the groups of people in the prison had taken certain wings. So as we spoke about earlier, L Block had 8 different wings running off a corridor, and each kind of group of people took a wing. So, for example, the Aryan Brotherhood occupied L2, the Muslim community occupied L5, Crips took one, so on and so forth. And they separated the guards into groups of 2, so 4 groups of 2, and they would pass them from wing to wing and keep them confused, unsure of where they were. And at this time, they were still blindfolded and handcuffed. They had no idea what was going on. Outside the prison, the police and FBI are getting ready to start hostage negotiations. A delicate and dangerous enough procedure in any circumstance, but a particularly volatile one here. They managed to get, the FBI managed to get into the tunnels underneath the prison, but not actually get into the prison. But they were able to get a somewhat decent wiretap to hear kind of what was going on while they were there.
Yeah.
However, what the FBI and police were unaware of is that during the riots, the inmates had managed to get a copy of the prison's kind of what to do in a hostage situation handbook provided to prisoners and officers.
Those crafty people.
So this meant that while negotiations were happening, inmates were able to understand the lines and the lingo and pretty much rebuff and counter-negotiate.
Why would you leave that there?
Well, it was just in an office locked up, but they've got full control, so they've smashed into everything now. They have access to everything. So the handbook even mentions that they need to bring morale down and draw them out and make them want to surrender quicker. So when the electricity, heating and water was cut, they were prepared for this. They knew it was going to happen and they didn't surrender. The first night of the riot / now hostage situation, inmates started taking the bodies of the dead inmates out and just dumping them in the prison yard. Upon autopsy, these inmates had been brutally beaten to death, including one who had had paper and plastic shoved down his throat and then was strangled with a cord. Not particularly pleasant deaths.
No.
The next morning, so day 2, George Skates, an inmate and leader of the Aryan Brotherhood. And I know we mentioned it a bit earlier, but for those of you who do not know what the Aryan Brotherhood are, the best way to describe them is nasty pieces of shit. They're basically white supremacist Nazi arseholes. They don't give a shit about anyone that is not Aryan. So, Aryan is the race that Hitler tried to create, the blonde hair, blue eyes, white race supremacy. Utter bell ends. So he comes out with a megaphone and states that they want to talk and they want to negotiate. So Lieutenant Lewis was on the megaphone on the police side, and they give him a number to call to speak to the negotiation team. This first and main demand that the inmates make is they wanted to talk to the media. The negotiator said that they would check and they would get back to them if they couldn't. George Skates then stated if they were able to talk to the media, they would release 2 hostages. But as per all hostage negotiations, a negotiator is not a supervising officer, so therefore they always have to check if the demands are okay. So say, for example, you're conducting a negotiation, Olivia, and you have the authority and they're like, we want to walk out free and a helicopter to fly us anywhere. They need someone who doesn't have the ability to grant that. It needs to be okayed by higher ups.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the inmates obviously knew this was the case because they had the bloody handbook. So they're like, yeah, well, we think you can do it, but whatever. So as this kind of like back and forth in the phone was taking place, the families of the guards held hostage were gathered in a school across the street from the prison, just waiting for news, really. Peggy Vallandigham, wife of hostage Robert Vallandigham, she refused to sit in the school and she sat in her car facing the prison, just watching and waiting. She also refused to eat while her husband was being held hostage because she knew he was not eating and she didn't want to eat till he was free and safe at home with her.
Oh,
I know. Obviously, this is now a massive off news story. However, the Ohio Correctional Department, they were controlling the story. They were the ones telling the media what they wanted to tell them. And the request made by the inmates for media interview was never passed on. Art Tate, the warden of the prison, he's since said that any demands the prisoners asked for, he would have just given them. Negotiations would have been over and the riot would have ended. But again, that goes back to the point of they need someone to okay it beforehand.
Yeah, it's also a bit unrealistic as well because it's like, how far can they take it and you still say yes?
Exactly. So inside the prison, Sadiq Hassan and George Skates, along with a few others, have pretty much taken up the leadership role with the whole Riot hostage situation, and we're running the show inside. Sadiq would stress that it wasn't a race war or a riot, and they were working together to raise awareness of the overcrowding and poor conditions and lack of human rights, and that they needed to work together. And believe it or not, they actually did.
Yeah.
I mean, they did to the sense that they all vandalized it. So there's some pretty horrific racist vandalism and all that over the place being sprayed, but they worked as a weird, fucked up collective team.
Yeah.
To create some sort of weird Lord of the Flies hierarchy in prison and how to get out of prison without being shot plan. Most of this involved talking to the media. So day 3 came and went, and the request for the media interview was still not met. And by day 4, when they were told they probably wouldn't be able to do a media interview and it was very unlikely to happen, the inmates took a bed sheet and they wrote in bright red, "You have 3.5 hours to meet our demand or we will kill a guard." And they hung it out one of the prison windows.
And like 4 days first demand and they don't deliver. It's like, come on.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly reasonable people we're dealing with, was it?
No. But I think if I was the leader of this little prison revolution, I'd be like, time's coming up. Like, this turnover is too slow for me. It's like,
bloody do it. So obviously the families who were camped out in the school, and Pam was sitting in a car, they could see the sheet come down, and so could the media who were sitting outside filming everything that was going on. But again, the Ohio State Correctional Department are still controlling the media. And in an interview, they said, and I quote, "This is simply a standard demand made by hostage takers. We are not worried about this." Unfortunately, what they didn't know is that one of the prisoners had a battery-powered radio. So despite there being no electricity, they heard this interview and knew their threat wasn't being taken seriously.
Yeah, they've got him.
Yeah. So although there had been this massive riot and 10 inmates had been murdered and they had 8 guards held as hostage, while the negotiations were taking place, although it was still a crazy, scary mental place to be, it had kind of calmed down in the prison itself a little bit. And, they'd started working together. I think they basically realized how fucked they were, that they've taken guards hostage, they weren't getting media attention, and they rioted in the prison. After the statement was made by the correctional department, the atmosphere in the prison changed. And that night, Officer Robert Vallandim was strangled to death. On the morning of the 5th day, the body of Robert was carried out and placed on the prison lawn. His wife, Pam, was sitting in her van and witnessed her husband's body being carried out by the inmates. I can't imagine how horrific that was.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
No one should have to go through that.
Never. So the inmates grant police safe passage onto the grounds to collect Robert's body, but leave immediately. How much of this was courtesy is debatable. Once they killed the officer, they knew they were fucked. And as far as they were concerned, they had a few hours till the police and SWAT team stormed the block and killed them all. They were utterly shitting themselves. There was no going back now. They actually created a maze with the bunk beds. So they took all the beds out of all the cells and literally created this weird sort of like crystal maze with beds. So when and if the SWAT teams did storm, they couldn't just run in and shoot everything. They had to kind of work the way through the maze.
It's quite clever.
Yeah, it is quite clever. They also made kind of booby traps. So they took big, heavy metal poles and tied them with sheets. So if the police came in, they could undo the sheets and it would fall on top of them and kill them. And they had made homemade bombs to throw at them.
What is the end game here? Like, yeah, it might take them a long time to find you and you may take out a few of them, but you're not going to be able to stay hidden in a prison for long unless you find a way to get out.
Well, I think this is the thing. I think they've realised that they're utterly screwed now. Now that they've killed an officer, there's no way out for them. They're screwed. They're done. So outside the prison, the mood had also changed. The public and SWAT teams were furious and ready to go. They wanted to storm, take everyone out, and get any guards that were left alive back. Because at this point, they didn't even know if the other guards were still alive. However, the negotiations were worried that by storming L Block, if there were officers still alive, this would result in them being killed.
Yeah, that's always the thing with negotiations, because you never know if anyone's going to keep their promise.
Exactly. So the public actually started gathering outside the prison with like signs and stuff. You know, signs people make like concerts or wrestling matches. They were kind of holding signs and kind of like chanting, like, and like shit was fading fast. Like it was going downhill outside the prison. It was going downhill inside the prison. Yeah, it's just a shitstorm all around at this point. So the negotiators are kind of just constantly calling this open line in the prison. They hadn't been able to get through for a few hours, but eventually George picks up the phone again. And they managed to convince him that if he came out that evening with one hostage, they would be able to give him a radio interview. So it took a little bit of convincing, but eventually George agreed. And in return, Officer Darrell Clark was released. So when this worked, the next day, another officer that was being held, Anthony Demon, he told Sadiq that he would convert to Islam and read their statement off on the radio and stand by them if they let him go. So when he came out of the prison, he read off their statement, and this was read while still on prison grounds, and then they let him walk away as a free man. Once he was out the prison, he gave another interview stating that he hadn't converted, He would not be standing by anyone, and that he did what he did just to get out.
And they can hear this.
Yeah, they can hear that. But he's out of the prison now, so he's free. And you know what? I actually don't blame the guy, because if I was in a hostage situation, I would tell anyone whatever it took to get me the hell out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I completely agree with you, but it's like you can't be a hero in those situations. Like, you literally do just have to say what you can to get out.
Completely, yeah, completely. And normally, like, if you're, shitting somebody's awareness that you're being treated poorly in this prison, normally you'd be like, what a dick for not actually doing it. But this guy's been held captive by these guys. They weren't his friends, they were his captors, and they had murdered his friend. He needed to get the fuck out of there. And I don't blame him. When he first came out and gave the first interview, some of his colleagues were really angry at him for doing this. But again, like, I don't blame him at all. I think he was actually quite smart, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think he shouldn't be sorry about it either. Be like, oh no, a few people don't like me. It's like, you get to live, you get to walk free and live your life.
Exactly. So moving on a couple of days, day 9, it's kind of like back and forth for a few days of just negotiating, trying to get more people out. So day 9 of the hostage situation, and another inmate, Jason Robb, replaces George Skates as the main negotiator. And at this point, they were negotiating to not be killed by snipers when they surrender. And in order to help them negotiate, they demand a lawyer to help them in negotiations. And they specifically request Nicky Schwartz, and they wanted to talk to him face to face. So on day 10, they managed to get Nicky there. They set up a meeting, and it's really weird. They literally have like a desk on one side of the prison fence and then the prisoners on the other side. When they meet Nicky, they demand that they show him his driver's license to prove his identity. They then hand Nicky this 2-page document of a list of 21 demands that they've written out that they need to end the siege, and ask him if they've signed it and the negotiators have signed it, is it legally binding? So Nicky's like, you've killed an officer. This 100% is not legally binding. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? So they talk back and forth, the prisoner and Nicky, and Nicky kind of acts as their negotiator from this point with the negotiators. And in the end, he kind of manages to convince them on these demands will be accepted. So the demands are that they not be killed upon surrender. And to guarantee this doesn't happen, it needs to be broadcast live on TV. There also needs to be neutral observers there to ensure the guards don't retaliate for Robert's murder. Finally, the state of the negotiators like, shit, yeah, we'll deal with it. We'll agree to that. They're going to surrender. So on the morning of day 11, broadcast live on TV, the inmates start walking out with their hands held up. However, the hostages inside were not aware that the surrender had taken place. So when the inmates come to get them and they're like, yo, dude, we surrendered. We're going to lead you out now. You're free. They didn't believe them, and they thought they were about to be taken to be murdered.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Mike Hensley, one of the hostages, was like, I'm not going, I don't believe you. And the inmates trying to say, no, we're surrendered, you're going free. And he's like, what do I need to convince you to make you know that I'm not going to kill you? And Mike says, I need you to walk in front of me, I need you to uncuff me, and I need my hands around your neck. So if you try to kill me, I'm going to strangle you and fight back. Bit savage, but I understand it, I guess.
Yeah. But it's also like the mentality you must be in at that point. It's just sheer terror all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially if you know someone's been strangled overnight.
Yeah, and they've been stuck in here for 11 days. They've been blindfolded and chained up, like handcuffed. They've been moved around different departments. They've had these guys, tapping the metal baseball bats, swinging them over their heads, being like, look, we can kill you anytime. They've literally almost like been mentally tortured in this place. Yeah.
It's like, how could you ever go to sleep in that situation as well? You'd have to sleep with one eye open, and you'd just think that, like, okay, I'm going to go to sleep tonight and I'm not going to wake up unless it's like electrical cord around my neck.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Ugh. It's horrific.
So, I need to cleanse my aura.
Bring some sage. So the hostages were taken out with the last group of inmates to leave the prison. And it was only when they felt the air in their face and saw sunlight creeping through the slight gaps in their blindfolds, they realised that they really were free. Finally, after 11 days of being held hostage, blindfolded and cuffed, they were free. The inmates were immediately seized, taken back into the gym in the prison, stripped naked and cuffed. They were held there till around 3 a.m. when correctional buses, like a group of state correctional buses, arrived, put them on there and transported them away to other prisons. However, L Block's now a crime scene and evidence has to be gathered. There was over 1,200 pieces of evidence to be photographed, processed, and searched for forensic evidence. It took them ages.
But
I have included a documentary of this in the link below. I'll include the links below. And I have also just included the video of them going in and filming L Block afterwards, like the crime scene footage. So yeah, I will put them in below. I do actually want to say, before I say anything else about that, both in the documentary, which is also available on Netflix, but I popped the YouTube link down there, and in the crime scene look through, there are quite a few trigger warnings. Both videos include footage of murder locations, meaning it's obvious someone has been murdered there. So there's a lot of blood and stuff on the floor. It can be quite graphic. There's also a lot, and I mean a lot, of very offensive racial slurs painted on the walls. If these are things that are you likely to trigger you, then don't watch the videos linked below. So once the prisoners were out and the crime scene's been processed, obviously it has to go to trial. 32 inmates gave evidence for the prosecution, including Snodgrass. After the trial, 5 inmates were sentenced to death for the murder of Robert Vallandim. These were Sadiq Hassan, George Skates, Jason Robb, Keith Lamar, and James Weir. However, it's very arguable that they are actually the ones responsible.
Yeah, I was going to say that's wild, because how can you know in a prison with that many people? How can you ever know for sure?
Exactly. Well, they were the ones who were actually trying to negotiate throughout. And it was the word of 32 inmates who were involved in an 11-day prison riot and hostage situation versus the word of 5 inmates who were involved in that same riot as to who did the murder. I think it was just volume of voices that got the conviction.
Who added the most petrol to the fire?
Exactly. The 5 that were sentenced to death still remain on death row and have yet to be executed, although there are quite a few people out there who kind of advocate for it to be looked into more because they don't believe that they are the ones who committed the crime. There is a really interesting radio show out there about it. Someone did a radio interview about it. Again, I've popped the link in to the YouTube link for that below for you guys to listen to. It's quite interesting to listen to that. Just form your own opinions on it, really, because I don't think we'll ever find out who was responsible for the murder of Robert Vallandim or the 10 inmates. But yeah, I've popped it there for you guys to listen to so you guys can form your own opinions as to what you think. But yeah, that is the story of the Lucasville prison riot. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's very easy for, I'm sure, any media outlet to kind of say, oh, these people that were in the prison that rioted, they're just degenerate monsters. But it's these people had their rights stripped away. And I'm sure things like this happen all the time. And overcrowding is still a thing.
Yeah.
Very much so. And it's also kind of people constantly being murdered in prisons to this day, being covered up. I'm sure we'll cover one, but I can't remember what their name was. But a couple of years ago, it was someone was found in a bin bag and they tried saying that they'd hung themselves, even though the evidence showed that they very clearly didn't.
Yeah, he hung himself and put himself in a bin bag. Yeah, that worked. But it's I know it's not the same at all, but it's kind of like that same railroading mentality. Look at the West Memphis 3. They were different. They were quote unquote goths of the era or whatever at the time in West Memphis, and they were completely railroaded and blamed for the murder of 3 boys that they probably didn't commit.
Yeah.
The amount of people who are sitting on death row for crimes they didn't commit are horrific.
Yeah. Rehabilitation always over anything else.
100%. Couldn't agree more, my friend. That was a very deep sigh there, Olivia.
It was. I was going to be like, come make me another cocktail, please.
Okay, I'll be there in 2 seconds.
Well, that was very good. That was very interesting. I had no idea that ever happened.
It was really lovely talking to you again for another week. As always, we are on all socials, Facebook as Don't Trust the Neighbours the Pod, Instagram as Don't Trust the Neighbours Pod, Twitter is the same, and we're also on TikTok. What's our TikTok handle again, Liv?
I think it's at Don't Trust the Neighbours.
Awesome. And if you want to drop us an email about anything, if you have any cases you would like us to cover or anything you feel is relevant that our platform can use to bring to light, please email us at don'ttrusttheneighbourspod@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, guys. It really does mean a lot to us. If you could pop us a like and review on Apple Podcast, it would be amazing. To everyone who has done that already, thank you so much. And we'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.